Thank you for taking time for our Lord. Make sure to subscribe for more videos. Claims that clash with its own desires. What we mean by being good is giving in to those claims. Some of the things the ordinary self wanted to do turn out to be wrong, so we must give them up. Other things turn out to be right, so we must do them. But we keep hoping that, after meeting all the demands, our natural self will still have some time to live its own life and do what it likes. In this way, we are like an honest man paying his taxes. He pays them but hopes there will be enough left over for him to live on. This is because we are still treating the natural self as the starting point. As long as we think like this, two results may happen. Either we stop trying to be good, or we become very unhappy. Make no mistake, if you truly try to meet all the demands on your natural self, it won't have enough left to live on. The more you obey your conscience, the more it will demand of you, and your natural self will feel starved, troubled, and angry. Eventually, you will either give up trying to be good or become one of those people who live for others, but in a grumbling, discontented way, always wondering why others don't appreciate it more. If you become like that, you will be harder to live with than if you had remained openly selfish. The Christian way is different, both harder and easier. Christ says, "Give me all." He doesn't just want some of your time, money, or work. He wants you. He hasn't come to torment your natural self, but to end it. No half measures will do. He doesn't want to cut off a branch here and there. He wants the whole tree gone. Hand over your entire natural self, including both desires you see as innocent and those you see as bad, the whole lot. He will give you a new self in return, his own self. It's both harder and easier than what we try to do. You may have noticed that Christ sometimes describes the Christian way as hard and sometimes as easy. He says, "Take up your cross," which sounds like being led to death in a concentration camp. But then he also says, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." Both are true, and you can see why. Teachers say the laziest student often works hardest in the end. They mean that if you give two boys a geometry problem, the one willing to work will try to understand it, while the lazy boy will try to memorize it, since that seems easier at the time. 6 months later, when preparing for exams, the lazy boy is doing hours of miserable work over things the other boy understands and enjoys in just a few minutes. Laziness leads to more work in the end. Or think of it like this. In a battle or mountain climbing, there's often one tough thing to do that, in the long run, is also the safest. If you avoid it, you'll find yourself in even worse danger later. The cowardly choice is often the most dangerous one. It's the same here. The hardest thing is to hand over your whole self, all your wishes and precautions, to Christ. But it's easier than what we're trying to do instead. We're trying to stay as we are, keep our personal happiness as the main goal, and still be good. We want to let our heart and mind focus on money, pleasure, or ambition while still behaving honestly, humbly, and purely. That's exactly what Christ warned us we couldn't do. A thistle can't produce figs. If I'm a field full of grass seed, I can't produce wheat. Cutting the grass keeps it short, but it's still grass. To grow wheat, I must be plowed and replanted. That's why the real challenge of Christian life starts where we don't expect. It begins the moment you wake up each morning. Your desires and plans rush at you like wild animals. The first task each day is to push them back. Listen to that other voice, take the other point of view, and let that larger, stronger, quieter life come in. This goes on all day, standing back from your natural fussing, coming out of the wind. At first, you can only do it for brief moments, but from those moments, the new kind of life starts to spread through your system. You're letting Him work on the right part of you. It's the difference between paint just on the surface and a dye that soaks through. When Christ said, "Be perfect," He wasn't speaking in vague, idealistic terms. He meant it. We need the full treatment. It's hard, but the compromise we're trying for is harder. It's impossible. It may be tough for an egg to turn into a bird, but it's far harder for an egg to learn to fly while staying an egg. We're like eggs now. We can't stay just an ordinary, decent egg. We must hatch or go bad. This is the whole of Christianity. There's nothing else. It's easy to get confused and think the church has many goals: education, building missions, holding services. Just like it's easy to think the state has many aims: military, political, economic, and so on. But things are simpler than that. The state exists to promote and protect the ordinary happiness of people in this life, a husband and wife chatting by the fire, friends playing darts at a pub, someone reading a book or gardening. That's what the state is for. If it's not helping to protect and prolong these moments, all the laws, parliaments, armies, and so on are just a waste of time. In the same way, the church exists for nothing else. The goal of everything, including the church, is to draw people into Christ and make them little Christs. If this isn't happening, all the cathedrals, clergy, missions, sermons, and even the Bible itself are pointless. God became man for this reason alone. It's even possible that the whole universe was created for no other purpose. The Bible says the universe was made for Christ, and everything will be gathered together in Him. None of us can fully understand how this will work for the entire universe. We don't know what, if anything, lives in parts of it far away from Earth, even on Earth. We don't know how it applies to things other than humans. But this is expected since we've only been shown the part of the plan that concerns us. What we have been told is how we can be drawn into Christ to become part of the wonderful gift the Prince of the Wonders wants to offer to His Father and Son. And us in Him. This is the only reason we were created. There are exciting hints in the Bible that when we are drawn in, many other things in nature will start to come right. The bad dream will be over, and it will be morning. The phrase good works is more familiar in modern Christianity than good work. Good works, like giving to charity or helping in the parish, are often seen as separate from one's everyday job. But good works don't always mean good work, as seen in some poorly made items sold at charity bazaars. This is not the example we were given. When Jesus provided extra wine at a wedding, He did both good works and good work. The wine was worth drinking. We are also told in Scripture that everyone must work, but not just any work that produces something good. The idea of good work isn't completely gone, though it's not especially common among religious people. You can still find it among craftsmen like cabinet makers, cobblers, and sailors. Sailors don't care if a ship is the biggest or most expensive. They judge it by its design and how it will handle rough seas. Artists still talk about good work, though less so, as they now prefer words like significant, important, contemporary, or daring. These aren't good signs. In fully industrialized societies, most people are stuck in a situation that nearly eliminates the idea of good work. Built-in obsolescence has become necessary for the economy. If products last too long, they won't need to be replaced, and sales will drop. 100 years ago, when a man got married, he might have a carriage built to last a lifetime. Now, he buys a car expecting to sell it in 2 years. Today, products aren't made to last. Zippers, for example, save the wearer a little time compared to buttons, but for the manufacturer, they have a greater advantage. They break down faster. Bad work is now the goal. We shouldn't take a purely moral view of this situation. It's not just the result of original sin or personal faults. It has crept in unnoticed. The degraded commercial mindset is both a cause and a result of it, and it can't be fixed by moral efforts alone. Originally, things were made for practical use or for enjoyment, often both. The hunter made his weapon as well as he could because a blunt or brittle tool wouldn't kill any game. His wife made a pot for fetching water as well as she could because she needed to use it. But they don't just make these items for use, they often decorate them, wanting everything to look nice. Just like Daubery in Shakespeare's Much Ado about Nothing wanted things handsome about him. And while they work, they likely sing, whistle, hum, or tell stories. However, into this simple situation, as unnoticed as the snake in Eden, comes a change. Eventually, families no longer make all they need themselves. A potter begins making pots for the whole village. A smith makes weapons, and a poet or musician tells stories and sings for everyone. It's interesting to note that, in mythology, the smith of the gods is often lame, and among men, the poet is blind. Perhaps this is how it all began. Those who were unfit for hunting or fighting were set aside to make things or provide entertainment for others. The key change here is that people are now creating items, pots, swords, songs, not for their own use or pleasure, but for others. And of course, they must be rewarded in some way for this work. This shift is necessary unless society and the arts are to stay stuck in a state of poor, simple, and inefficient living. The situation remains healthy because of two factors: First, these specialists must do their work well. They are directly facing the people who will use it. If a potter makes bad pots, the village women will complain. If the poet sings a dull song, he'll be shouted down. If the smith makes bad swords, at best the warriors will return and punish him, and at worst, they won't return at all, having been killed by the enemy. The village might even be destroyed, and the smith could be enslaved or killed. Second, because these specialists are doing something worth doing, they will often take pride in their work. We shouldn't idealize this. Not all specialists will find joy in their work. The smith might be overworked. The poet may get frustrated when the village insists on hearing the same song over and over while he wants to perform something new and exciting. But generally, these specialists live a life that is fitting for a person useful, with a reasonable amount of honor, and the joy of using their skills. I don't have enough space or knowledge to fully trace the journey from that time to today, but we can now see the essence of the change. Once people stopped making everything for themselves and began working for others, two types of jobs emerged. One type of job allows a person to say, "I am doing work that is worth doing. Even if no one paid me, it would still be worth doing. But since I need food, clothing, and shelter, I must be paid for it." The other type of job is work that exists only to earn money, work that wouldn't exist if it weren't for the payment. No one would do it otherwise. Thankfully, many jobs still fall into the first category. Farmers, policemen, doctors, artists, teachers, priests, and many others are doing work that is valuable in itself, work that people might do even without pay, and work that families in primitive isolation would attempt to do for themselves in some form. Of course, jobs like these aren't always pleasant. For example, caring for people in a leper colony is such a job. On the other end of the spectrum, there are jobs where money is the only purpose. Take the example of a professional prostitute. I'm not equating this morally with other jobs, but it's an extreme case of someone doing work solely for money. The particular horror of prostitution lies in the fact that it's an activity that has no other purpose or outcome except money. You can't go further in this direction than to sell something as intimate as sexual intercourse, not just without marriage, but without love. Even without lust. Another example of meaningless work is this. I often see billboards with a notice saying that thousands of people see this space, and your business should rent it to advertise its products. I think about how many steps away this is from making something truly good. A carpenter made the billboard, which in itself serves no purpose. Printers and paper makers produced the notice, which is worthless until someone rents the space. The space is worthless to the advertiser until they post another notice on it, which is still worthless unless it convinces someone to buy the goods being advertised. These goods may well be ugly, useless, or harmful luxuries that no one would have wanted unless the advertisement created a false desire for them with its flashy or snobbish appeals. At every step of this process, work is done with no real value other than the money it generates. This seems to be the inevitable outcome of a society that depends on buying and selling. In a rational world, things would be made because they were needed. In our world, desires must be created so people can make money by producing things. This is why the suspicion or disdain of trade found in earlier societies shouldn't be dismissed as mere snobbery. The more trade dominates, the more people are pushed into, and even begin to prefer, the second type of job, work done purely for pay, with no intrinsic value. Enjoying work and doing good work become privileges of a lucky few. The constant search for customers even affects international relations. In my lifetime, in England, money was raised to buy shirts for men who were out of work, yet the work they had lost was manufacturing shirts. Clearly, this situation can't last forever. Unfortunately, it's likely to collapse under its own contradictions, causing immense suffering. The only way to end it without pain is to find a way to stop it voluntarily. But I have no plan for that. And even if I did, none of the big men behind government and industry would listen. One slightly hopeful sign is the space race between America and Russia. Since our current problem isn't providing people with what they need or want, but keeping them busy making things, it doesn't really matter what is produced. The great powers could hardly find a better way to spend their time than by creating expensive objects and then launching them into space. This keeps money flowing and factories running without doing much harm, at least, not for a long time. But this is only a partial and temporary solution. For most of us, the practical task isn't to offer the big men advice on fixing the economy. We don't have any advice, and they wouldn't listen anyway. Instead, we should focus on how to live in this system with as little harm and degradation as possible. Simply recognizing that the system is flawed and irrational is already a step forward. Just as Christians have an advantage over others not by being less fallen, but by knowing they are fallen and living in a fallen world, we too. It can do better if we remember what good work once was and how impossible it has become for most people now. We may have to earn our living by helping to produce poor quality goods, which even if well made, wouldn't be worth producing, as their demand was artificially created by advertising. In such situations, we should still keep in mind, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. Of course, we should also stay alert for any chance of escape. If we have any say in choosing a career, though few of us do, we should aim to earn our living by doing well what would be worth doing even if we didn't need the money. This might require us to give up certain comforts, as it's usually the most absurd jobs that pay the most while also being the least demanding. But beyond all this, there is something more subtle. We must guard against allowing our way of thinking to be influenced by the changes in society. In my view, this shift has deeply affected our artists. Until quite recently, up until the late 19th century, it was generally accepted that the role of the artist was to entertain and instruct the public. Of course, different types of art appealed to different audiences. Street songs and oratorios weren't we same crowd, though many people probably enjoyed both. An artist could guide his audience toward appreciating finer things, but he could only do this by being entertaining and mostly understandable from the start. This has now changed. In the highest artistic circles today, we no longer hear about the artist's duty to us, but rather our duty to the artist. The artist owes us nothing. We owe him recognition, even if he has never bothered to consider our tastes, interests, or habits. If we don't give him that recognition, we are dismissed as ignorant. In this new view, the customer is always wrong. This shift in art mirrors a broader change in our attitude toward all work. As employment becomes more about giving people jobs rather than producing things people need or want, we begin to see every trade as existing primarily for the benefit of those who practice it. The smith no longer works so the warriors can fight. Rather, the warriors exist and fight so the smith can stay employed. The bard doesn't exist to entertain the tribe. Instead, the tribe exists to admire the bard. In industry, this change in attitude comes from both insanity and some credible motives. For example, a genuine concern for charity stopped us from talking about surplus population and shifted our focus to unemployment. The danger here is forgetting that employment is not the goal in itself. We want people employed as a way to ensure they are fed. We may think, rightly or wrongly, that it's better for people to be employed making bad things poorly than to do nothing at all. But while we have a duty to feed the hungry, I'm not sure we have a duty to appreciate the overly ambitious. This shift in attitude is damaging to good art. Many modern novels, poems, and paintings that we are pressured to admire are not good work because they aren't work at all. They are just puddles of spilled emotion or random thoughts. When an artist is truly working, they must consider the tastes, interests, and abilities of their audience. These factors are as much a part of the artist's raw material as the language, marble, or paint they use. Ignoring or defying these things isn't a mark of genius or integrity, it's laziness and incompetence. It shows the artist hasn't learned their craft. As a result, real, honest work in the arts is now mostly found in what some might call low art films, detective stories, and children's stories. These works are often well constructed, with seasoned craftsmanship, careful attention to detail, and skillfully calculated effort used to achieve what they set out to do. Don't misunderstand me, highbrow productions may show finer sensibility and deeper thought, but a puddle of feelings is not a work of art, no matter how rich the materials, whether wines, oils, or medicines poured into it. Great art, like any good work, must be well made. choirs should sing well or not at all. Otherwise, we only reinforce the majority's belief that the world of business, which efficiently produces so much that was never truly needed, is the real, adult, and practical world. Meanwhile, all this talk of culture and religion, horrible words, both remain seen as marginal, amateurish, and somewhat effeminate activities. In 1955, Mr. John Allen from Cambridge asked why so many people go out of their way to prove they are not intellectuals or cultured. I think I know the answer. Two parallels may help explain it. First, we all know people who cringe at the word refinement when it's used as social approval. Some even mock it by spelling it refane, implying that those who talk most about refinement are often the least refined. Whether we agree with this reaction or not, we can understand it. The person who shudders at the term feels that true refinement is least likely to be found among those who strive for it and talk about it constantly. People who are genuinely refined don't consciously avoid behavior like swaggering, spitting, or boasting. They simply don't consider such actions at all. Their training and sensitivity, which make them refined, instinctively reject such behavior without needing to think about it, just as we reject a bad egg without thinking about its effect on our stomachs. Refinement, then, is a label applied from the outside. To the refined person, it doesn't even appear as refinement. In fact, it doesn't become a conscious thought at all. The more it's talked about, the less it exists. My next parallel, though I mention it with hesitation, is religion. The word religion is rarely found in the New Testament or in the writings of mystics. The reason is simple. Those attitudes and practices we call religion are not really concerned with the concept of religion itself. To be religious means focusing on God and on one's neighbor in relation to God. Therefore, a religious person, when they are truly being religious, isn't thinking about religion. They don't have time for that. Religion is what we, or they later, might call their activity from an outside perspective. Of course, those who dislike words like refinement and religion may be doing so for the wrong reasons. They may want to impress us with how well-bred or holy they are by rejecting the terms. For such people, dismissing talk of refinement or religion is a way to show that they are free from vulgarity or worldliness. But there are others who genuinely and rightly believe that such talk isn't just a symptom of the problem, it actively causes the problem. Talking about refinement or religion can spoil these qualities where they already exist and prevent them from developing where they don't. The word culture seems to fall into this same category of dangerous and awkward terms. Whatever else it may mean, it certainly involves a deep, genuine enjoyment of literature and the arts. By enjoyment, I don't mean mere pleasure, a debated issue when discussing art, but a deeper, fuller experience. Like when we say someone enjoys good health or enjoys owning an estate. And if I am sure of anything, I am sure that when someone is truly enjoying Don Giovanni or the Aristeia, they are not thinking about culture at all. The word culture implies comparison, being more cultured than most people, just as being fat or clever means being fatter or cleverer than others. This turns the mind towards social comparisons and rankings. But what does that have to do with the horns blowing as the statue enters, or with Clytemnestra crying out? In Howard's End, E.M. Forster describes a girl listening to a symphony. She isn't thinking about culture, or even about music itself. She sees the whole world through the music. Culture, like religion, is a label given from the outside to activities that aren't concerned with culture as such. These activities would be ruined the moment they became focused on culture. This doesn't mean we should never talk about things from the outside. When dealing with things of high value that are easily destroyed, we must speak carefully. Perhaps the less we say, the better. Constantly focusing on the idea of culture, especially when it's viewed as something prestigious or enviable, seems to threaten the very enjoyments that give culture its worth. If we push ourselves or others to engage with great art just because it's a cultured thing to do, we stir up exactly the wrong impulses: the desire for self-improvement, the desire for distinction, the desire to separate from one group and align with another. These desires, whether good or bad on their own, are distractions that blind and paralyze us when it comes to appreciating art. Some might argue that by culture they don't mean just the enjoyment of art, but a broader habit of mind, a lasting enrichment that grows from experiencing and reflecting on art. possibly extending to a shared, sensitive social life among like-minded people. But even this interpretation leaves me with the same problem. I can imagine that a lifetime of art appreciation could lead to such a mindset, but only if the person didn't seek out art for that reason. Those who read poetry to improve their minds will never improve their minds by reading poetry. The true enjoyment of art must be spontaneous, driven by passion with no ulterior motive. The muses won't tolerate a marriage of convenience. The desirable mindset, if it develops at all, must come as an unintended byproduct. The very idea of making it a goal brings to mind Goethe's confession to Eckermann. In all my youthful love affairs, my aim was my own ennoblement. Most of us would respond that, even if we believed love could ennoble a young person, pursuing love for that purpose would fail because it wouldn't be true love at all. This applies to individuals, but the claims made for culture groups raise an awkward question. What evidence is there that culture leads to a more sensitive and enriched social life? If by sensitive we mean quick to take offense, a case could be made. Horace noted long ago that poets are a touchy group. The lives of Renaissance humanists and the letters in our most respected literary journals show that critics and scholars can be the same. But sensitivity in this sense doesn't enrich social life, it impoverishes it. Competitive and resentful egos don't create a more fulfilling society. The kind of sensitivity that enriches is the kind that prevents a person from hurting others, not the kind that makes them quick to feel hurt. Based on my experience, I don't see a direct link between culture and this positive kind of sensitivity. I've often found it among the uncultured, and among the cultured, I've sometimes found it and sometimes not. Let's be honest. I consider myself one of the cultured and don't wish to insult my own group. Even if others don't see me that way, I've lived among cultured people and don't intend to belittle my friends. But since we're speaking privately here, with the doors closed, let's be frank. The real betrayal of our group isn't pointing out its flaws, but flattering its self-satisfaction. I'm happy to admit that within our circle, there are men and women whose modesty, courtesy, fairness in debate, and willingness to understand others' views are truly admirable. I'm lucky to have known them. But we must also admit that, within our cultured circles, we show as high a percentage as any other group of bullies, paranoids, bowels, backstabbers, exhibitionists, moaners, cowards, and endless bores. Those who turn every argument into a fight are just as common among us as among the barely literate. The type of person who has a fragile ego, quick to hurt but equally quick to lash out, is almost as prevalent among us as among schoolgirls. If you doubt this, try a simple experiment. Take someone who loudly praises the refining and civilizing effects of culture and ask them about other poets, critics, or scholars, not in general, but by name. 9 times out of 10, they will deny those same virtues to almost everyone else. They'll likely struggle to find examples of culture leading to the results they boast about. Sometimes it seems they can only think of themselves. The conclusion we can draw from this behavior is summed up in Dr. Johnson's comment about the Irish. They are an honest people, they never speak well of one another in the same way. It's extremely doubtful that culture produces the qualities that allow people to interact graciously, loyally, or with lasting joy. When Voltaire said that culture softened our manners, he was flattering a barbarian king. And even if culture did all these things, we couldn't embrace it for those reasons. Because to consciously use culture for such purposes would strip it of the very qualities that lead to those ends. Many modern advocates of culture seem, to me, to lack a proper sense of humility or reverence. They handle the most delicate and precious experiences with the roughness of an auctioneer and talk about our deepest, most personal moments as if they were selling us a vacuum cleaner. Mr. Allen's phrase captures it well. In the 20th century, faith in culture is as bad as faith in religion. Both phrases imply a focus on the wrong things. Culture, like religion, becomes hollow when it is treated as a faith, a banner, or a cause. None of the activities we value, whether reading literature, listening to music, or viewing art, care at all for such faith. It's akin to ancient religious practices where names themselves were believed to hold power. Mr. Allen also noted that, When we've had enough of these culture mongers, we don't just leave the conversation, we often go to the opposite extreme, pretending to enjoy the lowest forms of entertainment and aligning ourselves with the least cultured people. For example, after spending an evening among young snobs pretending to enjoy fine port which you can tell they've only ever had from a grocery store, imagine stopping by a small tea shop on your way home. You overhear an old woman in a feathered boa say to her friend, with real pleasure, "That was a nice cup of tea, dearie. That did me good in that moment. Wouldn't this feel like a breath of fresh air?" Here at last is something genuine, someone truly focused on what they care about, expressing real pleasure from an honest experience. It's spontaneous and sincere, coming directly from the source. In the same way, after enduring a pretentious gathering where culture is paraded in artificial excess, but never in those gatherings of self-proclaimed cultured individuals do you hear a word or see a glance suggesting any real enjoyment of art, people, or nature. My heart, however, warms to the schoolboy on the bus, engrossed in his fantasy or science fiction book, oblivious to the world around him. Here I sense something real, genuine literary experience, spontaneous and compelling, with no ulterior motive. I have hope for that boy. Those who are deeply invested in any reading, regardless of genre, may someday come to appreciate great literature. The ability to appreciate exists in them, they are not incapable. And even if this particular boy never moves beyond science fiction, he has at least gained one precious thing. He forgets himself in his reading. I'd still prefer the live dog to the dead lion, perhaps even the wild dog to the overly groomed poodle. I wouldn't have spent so many words answering Mr. Allen's question, since neither of us matters enough to justify it, unless I thought this discussion led to something of greater importance, which I'll now try to explore. Mr. Forster feels anxious because he fears the rise of theocracy. Now, if he seriously expects a theocracy to take hold in modern England, I believe he's worrying about something completely unrealistic. However, I want to make it very clear that if such a thing were likely, I'd feel exactly as he does. I fully agree with the maxim, borrowed from a Christian, that all power corrupts. I'd go even further. The loftier the claims of power, the more meddlesome, inhuman, and oppressive it will become. Theocracy is the worst form of government imaginable. All political power is, at best, a necessary evil, and it's least harmful when its goals are modest and practical, when it claims nothing more than being useful or convenient and limits its objectives. Any power that claims to be transcendental, spiritual, or highly moral is dangerous because it tends to meddle in our private lives. Let the shoemaker stick to his trade. In my view, the Renaissance idea of the divine right of kings is a corruption of monarchy. Rousseau's general will is a corruption of democracy. Racial mysticism is a corruption of nationalism, and theocracy is the worst corruption of all. But I don't believe we're in any real danger of theocracy. What we are in danger of is something only slightly less intolerable, and it would be unbearable for many of the same reasons. I would call it chariantocracy, not the rule of saints, but the rule of the clever, the witty, the sensitive, the cultured, the integrated, or whatever the latest fashionable term might be. I'll explain how I think this could come about. The old social classes have broken up, and two things follow from this. On one hand, as Aristotle pointed out, most people dislike being seen as merely equal to everyone else. So we now see all kinds of people creating little groups where they can feel superior to the masses, self-appointed, unofficial aristocracies. The cultured increasingly form such a group. Notice their tendency to use terms like vulgar to describe those who disagree with them. Notice that Mr. Allen spoke of those who rebel against this group not as denying that they are intelligent, but as denying that they are intellectuals. They're not rejecting equality, but rather their exclusion from a class. On the other hand, a new ruling class is emerging, the managerial class, as it's sometimes called. The merging of these two groups, the self-appointed cultural aristocracy and the actual managerial rulers, will bring about this chariantocracy. The two groups are already coming together because education increasingly serves as the gateway to the managerial class. And of course, in some sense, education is a very appropriate way to select our rulers. We certainly don't want our leaders to be uneducated or incapable. However, we must be cautious because the blending of cultural elitism with managerial power creates a new form of oppression. When those who believe they are more cultured, sensitive, or intellectually superior gain real political power, they can become just as meddlesome and controlling as any theocracy. They might impose their views on society, not out of spiritual zeal, but from a belief that their refined tastes and intellectual insights entitle them to direct the lives of others. And that is a danger we cannot ignore. But education today is taking on a new and more invasive role. It aims to do far more to the student than education ever did before, except perhaps for the training provided by the Jesuits. One reason for this is that modern students are far more defenseless in the hands of their teachers. Increasingly, they come from homes, whether businessmen's flats or workmen's cottages, where there are few, if any, books. They have hardly ever experienced solitude. The educational system captures them at a very young age and organizes their entire life, leaving no room for unsupervised leisure or independent thought. The long, unstructured hours of unsponsored, possibly forbidden, reading the wanderings of mind and body through which previous generations first discovered literature, nature, and themselves are a thing of the past. If a Traherne or a Wordsworth were born today, he would be cured of his individuality before he reached the age of 12. In short, the modern student is the perfect patient for educators who, not content with teaching a subject, seek to shape a person's character pliable, moldable, and utterly dependent on them. And if, by chance, nature allows a child to develop some powers of resistance, these teachers know how to deal with that too. I'll get to that in a moment. Second, the nature of teaching has changed. In some ways, it has improved. Teaching now demands far more from the teacher and, as a result, makes the work more interesting for them. It has become more intimate and penetrating, focusing not only on ensuring the student reads and remembers the text, but also on fostering appreciation at first glance. This sounds like a good idea, and it's hard to argue with it. Yet, there is a danger here. People now laugh at the old test papers with their context questions, asking, "What good could that do a boy?" But demanding that the test paper do good is like asking a thermometer to heat a room. The reading of the text was supposed to do the boy good. The test simply checked if he had read it. And because the test didn't force him to produce appreciation on command, it left him free to develop his own appreciation, privately and spontaneously, as an out-of-school activity that would never earn him marks. That relationship between him and Virgil, or him and Shakespeare, was personal. 9 times out of 10, probably nothing happened, but on the occasions when appreciation did occur, it was real, suited to his age and character, a natural growth from his own soil and experience, not something exotic or artificial. But when we replace these old test papers with exercises in practical criticism, we create a new situation. Now, the student won't get good marks or ultimately get into the managerial class unless he produces the kinds of responses, uses the kind of analytic method that pleases teachers. At best, this leads to a premature, forced development of responses and methods that are inappropriate for his age. At worst, it trains him in the relatively easy art of pretending, simulating the right responses. Nearly all bright boys are excellent mimics. Trust me, before you've been teaching a term, everyone in the class will know the sort of stuff that pleases prickly Popeye the teacher. In the old days, students understood that what the teacher wanted were simply the correct answers to factual questions. There were only 2 ways to deliver those answers: by working or cheating. But now, it's not even the individual teacher's preferences that the students are catering to. We've moved beyond that. Somewhere, though I haven't yet pinpointed, where there seems to be a culture monger's central bureau keeping a close watch for deviation. Someone out there sends schoolmasters little leaflets with half a dozen poems printed on them, and not only instructing teachers which poems their pupils must prefer, but also explaining exactly why they must prefer them. The arrogance of it. Imagine what a real master or a bore would have done with such leaflets. Thus, to say that under the current regime, education is the sole path to entry into the ruling class doesn't merely mean that a failure to acquire knowledge or reach a certain level of intellectual competence will exclude you. That would be reasonable enough. But now, the issue is deeper. The system demands that students conform in their responses, attitudes, and tastes in order to advance. But this new system may already mean something, or perhaps it already does. It means that you cannot enter the ruling class unless you become, or at least make your teachers believe you have become, a very specific kind of person, someone who gives the right responses to the right authors. In fact, you can only succeed by becoming, in the modern sense of the word, cultured. This situation is different from what has occurred in the past. Historically, many ruling classes have eventually embraced culture and patronized the arts. But in those cases, culture was a result of their position. It was a luxury or privilege of their class. The situation we now face is almost the opposite. Entry into the ruling class will be the reward of culture. Thus, we are headed toward gerontocracy, a society ruled by the cultured. Not only is this shift likely to happen, it is already being planned and openly discussed. Mr. J.W. Sanders, in his excellent article titled Poetry in the Managerial Age Essays and Criticism, July 1954, lays it all out. He confronts the fact that modern poets are read almost exclusively by other poets. Instead of suggesting that poets reconnect with the public, Saunders offers a different solution. He doesn't propose that poets should change because in our current cultural climate, it's assumed that if artists and audiences lose touch, the fault always lies with the audience. I've never seen this doctrine proven, but it seems universally accepted. Saunders' remedy is to provide poets with a conscript audience, a privilege last enjoyed by Nero. He explains how to achieve this. We get our leaders through education. Success in examinations is the path into the ruling class. So, we should make poetry, specifically the intellectual discipline fostered by critical reading of poetry, the backbone of the educational system. In other words, practical criticism, especially focused on modern poets, should become the indispensable subject. Failing at this excludes you from the managerial class, thus securing poets a guaranteed audience. Every child born into this system will face a choice: read the poets that the cultured elite approve of, and say the kinds of things they want you to say about them, or be cast out. This also addresses how gerontocracy can deal with the minority of students who have tastes of their own and aren't easily molded. Those students will receive low marks, be kicked off the educational ladder early, and disappear into the lower classes. There's another advantage to this system. By creating a conscript audience, you can ensure that the current literary elite will remain in power indefinitely. The students who are kicked off the ladder, those who resist conforming to the approved tastes, are the very people who, in earlier times, would have started new schools of thought and artistic movements. If there had been a strict gerontocracy in place back then, the young Chaucer, the young Donne, the young Wordsworth, and Keats could have been suppressed. Literary history, as we know it, might never have happened. Humanity, which has long been a wild animal, will have become tame. Having explained why I think gerontocracy is likely, I must now explain why I think it's undesirable. Culture is a poor qualification for a ruling class because it does not equip people to govern. The qualities we need in our leaders: mercy, financial integrity, practical intelligence, hard work, and so on, are no more likely to be found in cultured individuals than in anyone else. In fact, culture as a qualification is as flawed as sanctity. Both are difficult to accurately assess and easy to fake. Not every gerontocrat will be a hypocrite, just as not every theocrat is insincere. But both systems encourage hypocrisy and make the genuine pursuit of the qualities they claim to value more difficult. In the end, culture, like sanctity, is not a reliable measure of a person's ability to lead. It can lead to pretense and a disconnect from the real qualities that are needed to govern effectively. This is why I believe that placing culture as the central criterion for leadership is not only flawed but dangerous. Hypocrisy is not the only danger these systems encourage. Just as there are dangers in shallow forms of piety, there are also dangers in shallow forms of culture. In piety, we have the goody-goody youth who has never questioned or risen above the routine respectability of his upbringing. His conformity wins him the approval of his parents, neighbors, and even his own conscience. He doesn't know he's missed anything and remains content. In culture, we have the adaptable youth for whom poetry has always been something to analyze for school exercises. Success in these exercises has brought him pleasure and entry into the ruling class. He, too, doesn't know what he's missed. He doesn't know that poetry ever had a deeper purpose, and he remains content. Both types deserve pity, but both can also be quite unpleasant. Both may exhibit spiritual pride, but each in its own way. The goody-goody has succeeded by suppressing rebellion and complying, while the cultured youth has succeeded by winning competitive performances. The pride of the former is sly, simpering, and demure, what Mr. Allen might call smug, especially if we include its older meaning of complacency. For the latter, I'd use the word swaggering in my experience. This type tends to be raw, aggressive, eager to inflict hurt, insatiable in demanding submission, and resentful of any disagreement. The goody-goody sneaks and slinks, sometimes scratching like a cat. In contrast, his cultured counterpart gobbles like an enraged turkey, and perhaps both are even more incurable than the outright hypocrite. A hypocrite might repent and change, or at least be exposed and rendered harmless. But who can bring to repentance those who aren't even trying to deceive, who don't know they aren't the real thing because they don't know that there ever was a real thing? Finally, my objections to theocracy and Shariantocracy converge. The higher the pretensions of our rulers, the more meddlesome and intrusive their rule will be, and the more the very ideals they claim to represent, whether sanctity or culture, will be tarnished. The highest things have the most fragile hold in our nature, and by making sanctity or culture the basis for power, you drive them out of the world. Let our leaders leave these things alone. Leave us some space where the spontaneous, the unmarketable, and the utterly private can still exist. In this regard, I think Mr. Allen fell short. When he spoke of retreating from the faith and culture, I believe we don't need retreat. We need an attack, or, if you prefer, rebellion. I write in the hope of stirring others to rebel, as far as I can see. This issue has nothing to do with the difference between Christians and those called humanists, though I dislike that term because it once had a very useful and different meaning. I hope that red herring doesn't enter the discussion. I believe many atheists and agnostics care deeply about the same things I care for. To them, I say the faith and culture is going to strangle all these things unless we can strangle it first, and there is no time to waste. Faith, in some circles, is often misunderstood. I have heard talks at the Socratic Club in Oxford where a contrast is drawn between the so-called Christian attitude and the scientific attitude, and belief. We're told that the scientist feels it is his duty to adjust the strength of his belief according to the evidence, believing less when there is less evidence, and withdrawing belief entirely when solid evidence contradicts it. On the other hand, it is claimed that Christians see it as virtuous to believe without evidence, or even against the evidence, holding fast to their beliefs no matter what reality throws at them. If this were a fair portrayal of the situation, the coexistence of such scientists and such Christians within the same species would indeed be staggering. The fact that these two groups seem to overlap as much as they do would be utterly inexplicable, and any discussion between them would be hopeless. But the purpose of this essay is to show that things are not as bleak as that. The sense in which scientists proportion their beliefs to the evidence, and the sense in which Christians do not, both need to be defined more carefully. My hope is that once this is done, while disagreement between the two sides may still remain, they will not be left staring at one another in wholly dumbfounded incomprehension. To begin with, let's take a closer look at belief in general. I do not think the practice of proportioning belief strictly to the evidence is as common in the scientific life as has been claimed. Scientists are, in fact, often not concerned with merely believing things. Scientists, when at work, are not primarily concerned with belief in the way we usually use the word. They are focused on finding things out, on moving from belief or speculation into knowledge. No one says they believe in something once they have established it as fact. For example, a doctor might say he believes a man was poisoned before examining the body, but after the examination, he will simply state the man was poisoned. Similarly, no one says they believe in the multiplication table, or that they believe someone was stealing when they catch a thief in the act. In science, the goal is to move from belief to certainty. to get beyond speculation and into the realm of established knowledge. Of course, scientists use hypotheses, which are essentially guesses or suppositions, but these are not the same as beliefs. Hypotheses are tools used to guide experiments and exploration, not convictions about how things are. So, if we want to understand a scientist's behavior around belief, we shouldn't look to their work in the lab, but rather to their personal lives in their leisure time. In modern English, the verb believe generally expresses a weak level of certainty. For example, if someone says, "Where has Tom gone?" and another replies, "To London," I believe the speaker wouldn't be very surprised if it turned out Tom hadn't gone to London after all. Similarly, what was the date? 430 BC. I believe shows the speaker is not sure of the answer. This same sense of uncertainty is conveyed in negative forms as well. Is Jones coming? I believe not means the speaker thinks it's unlikely but isn't certain. However, when the negative is framed differently, it becomes much stronger. I don't believe it, or I don't believe him expresses a far stronger conviction, almost as strong as knowledge itself, especially if said with emphasis or anger. For instance, "Where's Mrs. Jones off with the butler?" I don't believe it. The intensity here, particularly if expressed emotionally, might imply a subjective conviction that feels nearly as strong as direct experience. The other special usage of "I believe" comes from religious contexts, especially among Christians. It's not difficult for a hardened materialist to understand the mental attitude behind a Christu or Kariv, even if they don't agree with it. The materialist need only think of how they might respond to hearing about a miracle, "I don't believe it," and imagine the same conviction, but in reverse. From the Christian's point of view, the materialist knows they can't instantly produce a refutation of the miracle with the certainty of a mathematical proof. Yet the mere formal possibility that the miracle could have occurred doesn't really trouble them, any more than they'd worry about water suddenly not being H2O. In the same way, a Christian's belief doesn't necessarily rely on demonstrative proof, and the mere formal possibility that God might not exist doesn't trouble them in the form of any real doubt. Of course, some Christians do claim there is demonstrative proof of God's existence, just as some materialists claim there's proof against it. In such cases, these individuals would not be in a state of belief or disbelief, but rather knowledge if they truly hold such proof. What we're discussing here is belief and disbelief in their strongest form, but still short of knowledge. Belief in this sense, for both the scientist and the Christian, seems to be an acceptance of a proposition that is so overwhelmingly probable that it excludes any real psychological doubt, even if it doesn't logically exclude debate. There's still a formal possibility of being wrong, but it feels so unlikely that it doesn't inspire any true skepticism. Now, one might ask if this kind of strong belief is exclusive to religious or theological propositions. I don't think so. Many beliefs come close to this probabilities that seem so strong that the absence of logical certainty doesn't cause us the slightest doubt. The scientific beliefs held by non-scientists often have this quality, especially among those who are less educated. For example, most of us believe in the principles of gravity or electricity without personally verifying the scientific evidence. Similarly, most of our beliefs about other people fall into this category. We believe our friends are trustworthy, our spouse is faithful, and so on, without having demonstrative proof. The scientist himself, outside the lab, holds these sorts of beliefs about the people in his life. Though these beliefs aren't entirely without evidence, they are not held with the same rigorous standards applied in scientific inquiry. Instead, they are based on probabilities and past experiences that make the person feel certain, even without conclusive proof. This kind of belief, whether in science or in personal relationships, operates similarly to religious belief in that it excludes doubt at a psychological level, even if it doesn't exclude all formal possibilities of error. But often we hold beliefs with more certainty than the evidence, if analyzed strictly in a scientific manner, would justify. Most people of my generation, for instance, had a strong belief in the reality of the external world and the existence of other people, essentially, a disbelief in solipsism far exceeding what any argument could definitively prove. While it's now said that this was due to category mistakes and that solipsism was a pseudo-problem, we didn't know that in the 1920s, yet we still disbelieved in solipsism. Of course, I'm not talking about belief without any evidence at all. It's important to distinguish between how a Christian first comes to assent to certain propositions and how they hold on to those beliefs afterward. These two stages are different. It is true that Christians in some cases recommend discounting certain types of contrary evidence, and I'll explain why later. But as far as I know, no one is expected to assent to Christian propositions initially without evidence, or in direct opposition to the evidence. If anyone holds that view, I certainly do not. In fact, anyone who becomes a Christian typically believes they have good evidence for it, whether it's metaphysical evidence like Dante's historical evidence, religious experience, or a combination of these. Even authority, though it may vary in value from one instance to another, is a kind of evidence. Most of our historical beliefs, many of our geographical beliefs, and much of what concerns us in daily life are accepted based on the authority of others. This holds true whether we are Christians, atheists, scientists, or everyday people. The purpose of this essay isn't to evaluate the specific evidence Christians use to base their beliefs. That would require a full-scale theological argument. My goal here is simply to point out that, at the very least, this evidence cannot be so weak as to justify the view that all believers are indifferent to evidence. The history of thought clearly shows that believers are not divided from non-believers by some significant intellectual inferiority or refusal to think. Many believers have been great minds, some were scientists. We might think they were mistaken, but their error must have been at least plausible, given the variety and strength of the evidence they considered. We can also see the plausibility of religious belief from the multitude of arguments raised against it. There isn't just one case made against religion, but many. Some argue, like Capaneus and Statius, that religion is a projection of our primitive fears. Others, like Marx, claim it's a tool of oppression, created by wicked kings, priests, or capitalists. Still others, like Fraser, think it arose from dreams about the dead, while Freud argued it's a psychological complex. More modern thinkers suggest it's a category mistake. The sheer number and diversity of these arguments indicate that religion is not something that was obviously implausible from the start. An error requiring so many defensive weapons to counter it suggests it is, at the very least, a respectable enemy. Of course, there are people today who argue that the entire situation has changed because of the doctrine of the concealed wish. These people admit that otherwise rational individuals have been deceived by religious arguments, but they claim the real deception lies in their own desires. They suggest that people want religion to be true, and so they produce arguments to justify it as a form of rationalization. According to this view, the arguments for religion have never been plausible in themselves, but only seemed that way because they were secretly weighted by wishful thinking. I don't deny that this kind of thing happens. Wishful thinking certainly affects how people approach religion, just as it affects their thinking about other matters. But as a general explanation for why people assent to religious beliefs, the idea that it's purely based on wishful thinking is, to me, quite useless. On the question of belief in God, people's wishes can favor either side or both. The assumption that everyone would be pleased and only pleased if Christianity were true is simply ridiculous. If Freud is right about the Oedipus complex, then surely there's a significant psychological pressure for people to wish that God does not exist, as atheism might satisfy a deep, suppressed desire. In this case, atheism could be seen as gratifying one of our strongest hidden impulses. This argument, in fact, could easily be flipped and used to support theism as well. However, I have no intention of using it this way, because it's ultimately ambivalent. Human beings have desires pulling in multiple directions. There are wishes for God's existence and wishes against it. There's not just wish fulfillment, but also fear fulfillment. A person who fears Christianity might tend to believe atheism, simply because it confirms what they most fear to be false. Conversely, a person who fears atheism might lean toward Christianity. So, instead of one straightforward situation where wishes solely push in one direction, there are at least 4 possible scenarios. 1. A person could be a Christian because they want Christianity to be true. 2. A person could be an atheist because they want atheism to be true. 3. A person could be an atheist while secretly wishing Christianity were true. 4. A person could be a Christian while secretly wishing atheism were true. These possibilities cancel each other out. They may help us analyze a particular case of belief or disbelief, where we know the person's specific background and motivations, but as a general explanation of why people hold religious beliefs, they won't help us much. They don't invalidate the idea that there is evidence both for and against Christianity, and that rational, honest minds can interpret the evidence differently. So I ask you to consider a different, more nuanced picture than the one we started with. Initially, we had a scenario where 2 types of people: scientists who proportion their belief to evidence, and Christians who do not, were left facing one another across a vast chasm. But a more accurate picture, I think, is this: all people, when faced with questions that deeply interest them, try to move from the realm of belief to the realm of knowledge whenever they can. When they achieve this, they stop saying "I believe" and start saying "I know." Different disciplines have different methods for moving from belief to knowledge. Mathematicians, for example, use a particularly clear and strict method of reasoning. Scientists have their own techniques, often involving experiments. Historians rely on documents, and judges use testimony. These methods are different, but all of them aim to replace belief with knowledge. However, in matters outside their own fields of expertise, all people, including scientists and mathematicians, hold numerous beliefs. These beliefs are not always subjected to the rigorous standards of their own disciplines, nor should they be. It would seem excessive, even bordering on the neurotic or insane, if people applied scientific or mathematical rigor to every belief in everyday life. These beliefs, whether weak or strong, vary in certainty. At their strongest, we find statements like the Christian's "I believe" or the atheist's "I don't believe a word of it." The subject matter of these beliefs, whether there is a God, doesn't necessarily demand such strong convictions, but for some people, it does. There are those whose belief or disbelief is accompanied by subjective certainty, and there are those whose attitudes are more moderate. All these beliefs, whether weak or strong, are based on what the individual perceives as evidence. The stronger believers and disbelievers think they have very strong evidence to support their views. There's no need to assume that one side is being completely irrational or unreasonable. The disagreement comes down to a difference in how the evidence is weighed. One side has made a mistake in interpreting the evidence, but it's not a glaring, obvious mistake, otherwise the debate would have ended long ago. So this brings us to how Christians come to assent to certain propositions. It's not that Christians are indifferent to evidence, nor that they believe without evidence. Rather, their belief stems from a rational process, just as atheists or agnostics may arrive at their disbelief through reasoning. The key point is that belief, whether religious or not, often involves weighing evidence in ways that are subject to human error, not wholesale rejection of reason. Now, we need to consider something entirely different: the adherence of Christians to their beliefs after they have been formed. This is where the charge of irrationality and resistance to evidence becomes especially significant. It must be admitted straight away that Christians often do praise such adherence as if it were a virtue. In fact, the stronger the apparent evidence against their faith becomes, the more praiseworthy this adherence is seen to be. Christians even warn each other that trials to faith, or temptations to doubt, are to be expected, and they resolve in advance to resist them. This is certainly very different from the behavior we expect from scientists or historians in their respective fields. In those disciplines, ignoring or slurring over even the faintest evidence against a favored hypothesis is considered foolish and shameful. A hypothesis must be exposed to every test, and every doubt must be welcomed. However, I would argue that a hypothesis is not the same as a belief. If we move away from thinking of the scientist only in terms of hypotheses and look instead at the scientist's beliefs in their everyday life, I think the stark contrast between them and the Christian would be softened. Let's take an example. Suppose, for the first time, a doubt about his wife's fidelity crosses a scientist's mind. Does he feel it is his duty to entertain this doubt with complete impartiality, devising a series of experiments to test the hypothesis of infidelity and then awaiting the results with total neutrality? No doubt, in some extreme cases, this might happen. There are unfaithful wives and there are husbands who act like scientists. But would this be the course his fellow scientists would recommend as the first step, or as the only one consistent with his honor as a scientist? I doubt it. Most of us, I think, would see such a reaction as morally flawed rather than intellectually virtuous. This example is not meant to draw a perfect parallel between Christian tenacity and belief and the scientist's behavior in personal life. After all, evidence of a wife's infidelity might eventually accumulate to a point where the scientist would be foolish to ignore it. The key difference, of course, is that Christians seem to praise a kind of adherence to belief that holds out against any evidence, no matter how strong. Now I'll attempt to explain why such praise is, in fact, a logical conclusion from the Christian belief system itself. To do so, it helps to think of situations where the roles are reversed, where we demand this kind of faith from others. There are times when we can provide all the help a person needs, but only if they trust us, even in situations where their senses, imagination, and intelligence tell them not to. Consider trying to free a dog from a trap, pulling a thorn from a child's finger, teaching a boy to swim, or guiding a frightened novice over a dangerous spot on a mountain. In each case, the one thing that can prevent us from helping is their distrust. We are asking them to trust us in defiance of the immediate perceptions, asking them to believe that something painful will actually relieve their pain, or that what looks dangerous is their only path to safety. We ask them to accept what seems impossible, that moving the paw farther into the trap is the way to get it out, that hurting the finger more will eventually stop the pain, that water clearly permeable will actually support their body, that letting go of the closest support is the way to avoid sinking, or that climbing higher to a more exposed ledge is the way to avoid falling. In all these cases, we can only rely on the other person's trust in us, trust that is not based on evidence, at least not evidence in the scientific sense. It's often based on something much more intangible, the look of our face, the tone of our voice, or, in the case of a dog, even just our scent. Sometimes, because they can't muster that trust, we are unable to help them at all. This analogy sheds some light on why Christians value faith in the face of apparent contrary evidence. In the Christian worldview, God asks for the same kind of trust. The faith that Christians praise is the trust to believe that what seems painful or impossible, whether it's following God's commandments, enduring suffering, or facing doubt, is actually the way to salvation or deeper truth. Just as we would ask someone to trust us, even when they don't fully understand our reasons, so Christians believe that God asks them to trust Him, even when they don't fully understand His purposes. From this perspective, the Christian adherence to belief, even against evidence that seems contrary, is not simply blind stubbornness. Rather, it reflects a trust that God knows best, even when the immediate evidence seems confusing or painful. Just as a child doesn't fully grasp why their finger must hurt more before it gets better, the Christian may not fully grasp why their faith must be tested, but they trust that in the end, it's for their good. In summary, while this kind of adherence may seem irrational when compared to scientific methods within the framework of Christianity, it is a logical and even necessary response to a belief in a personal, trustworthy God who sometimes asks for trust beyond immediate understanding. If we succeed in helping someone, whether it's freeing a dog from a trap, pulling a thorn from a child's finger, or guiding a novice climber over a dangerous spot, it is because they maintained their trust in us, even when the immediate evidence seemed to be against us. And no one blames us for asking for that trust, nor do they blame the dog, child, or climber for giving it. Afterward, no one says, "What an intelligent dog or child or climber," for trusting their rescuer. Similarly, if the young mountaineer were a scientist, his decision to trust beyond what the logical evidence demanded wouldn't be held against him when he later came up for a fellowship. No one would accuse him of violating Clifford's rule about proportioning belief to evidence. Now, to accept the Christian propositions is, in fact, to believe that we are always to God as that dog, child, or climber was to us, only to a much greater degree. From this belief, it logically follows that the kind of behavior appropriate for the dog, child, or climber in relation to us is also appropriate for us in relation to God, again, to a much greater degree. Let me be clear, I am not saying that the strength of our initial belief in Christianity must, by psychological necessity, lead to this kind of trust. Rather, I am saying that the content of the belief itself logically entails that such trust is appropriate. If human life is indeed governed by a beneficent being whose knowledge of our needs and how they can be fulfilled far surpasses our own, then it stands to reason that his actions will often seem, to us, neither beneficent nor wise. Therefore, it is our highest prudence to place our confidence in him, despite how things may appear. This expectation is reinforced by the fact that, in Christianity, we are warned in advance that apparent evidence against our faith will arise, evidence that may be strong enough to deceive. If possible, even the elect. Our situation, however, is made bearable by two things. First, despite the apparent contrary evidence, we also seem to receive favorable evidence. Some of this evidence comes from external events, like when I feel an inexplicable urge to visit someone, only to find that they had been praying for me to come that very day. Other evidence is more personal and relational, much like how a dog might trust its rescuer based on their voice, look, and smell. For Christians, we feel something like a knowledge by acquaintance with the God we believe in, however intermittent or imperfect it may be. We trust not just because a God exists, but because this God exists. Even if we ourselves sometimes struggle to claim personal knowledge of him, we trust Christendom and its representatives, people whose character and lives have earned our trust. Second, we believe we already understand why, if our original belief is true, this kind of trust beyond the evidence, and often against it, is demanded of us. The issue at hand is not simply about getting help out of one difficult situation, like a dog being freed from a trap or a climber overcoming one tough spot. In Christianity, we believe that God's purpose is to create a deep, personal relationship with each of us, a relationship analogous to friendship or even romantic love. Complete trust is an essential component of that relationship, and such trust can only grow in an environment where there is also room for doubt. To love someone is to trust them beyond what the evidence might immediately support, and sometimes even against strong evidence. No one would call someone a true friend if they only believed in our good intentions when they had solid proof of them. Similarly, no one is a true friend who is quick to accept negative evidence about us. In human relationships, trust between people, despite the possibility of failure, is almost universally seen as a moral virtue, not a logical error. And a suspicious person who always demands proof and is quick to doubt is criticized for being mean-spirited, not praised for their logical rigor. Thus, there is no real parallel between Christian perseverance in faith and a bad scientist stubbornly clinging to a hypothesis after the evidence is clearly turned against it. Unbelievers often understandably get the wrong impression because they encounter Christianity mainly through apologetic works, where God's existence and benevolence are treated as speculative questions, just another theory to be debated like any other. In those contexts, God must be treated as a hypothesis that can be examined and questioned. But for the Christian, God is not a hypothesis. He is a reality, or at least believed to be one, known through trust and relationship. And in the same way that we trust a friend beyond the evidence, Christians trust God beyond what might seem immediately justifiable. This doesn't make the faith irrational, but rather reflects the nature of trust itself. Trust inherently involves going beyond cold calculation, and in human relationships, this is seen as a mark of virtue. So too in Christianity, trust is essential to the relationship God seeks to have with us. Once you answer the question of God's existence in the affirmative, everything changes. To believe that this God exists is no longer just an intellectual position. It means you, as a person, now stand in the presence of God as a person. What were once mere variations in opinion or arguments requiring intellectual assent are now transformed into personal attitudes toward another person. You are no longer dealing with an abstract argument, but with a being who demands your trust and confidence. A faint analogy would be this. It is one thing to ask hypothetically whether someone will join us tonight, and another thing entirely when that person's honor is pledged to come and something important depends on their arrival. In the first case, as the night wears on, it might be reasonable to expect them less and less. But in the second case, if we've known them to be reliable in the past, continuing to expect them, even late into the night, would be based on their character. And if they arrived with a perfectly good explanation just after we had given up on them, we would feel slightly ashamed, realizing that we ought to have known them better. Of course, we fully recognize how agonizingly two-edged this can be. If this kind of faith happens to be true, it's exactly what we need. But if it's ungrounded, it can be ruinous. The dog may trust the person who rescues it from the trap, only to discover the person's true intention is to perform a vivisection. The ducks that come when called dilly dilly, come and be killed, trust the farmer's wife, only to have their necks wrung. There's also that famous French story about the fire in the theater. Panic was spreading, and the audience was about to become a mob. Suddenly, a large, bearded man leaped onto the stage, raised his hand nobly, and commanded everyone to remain calm. Such was his authority and presence that everyone obeyed him. As a result, they were all burned to death, while the man quietly exited through the wings, took a cab, and went home to bed. The demand for trust made by a true friend is exactly the same as the demand made by a con artist. The refusal to trust a trickster is sensible, but withholding trust from a true friend can be deeply damaging to the relationship. Being forewarned and prepared for apparently contradictory appearances is rational if your belief is true. But if your belief is a delusion, this same readiness would be the very means by which the delusion becomes unshakable and incurable. And yet, to be aware of these possibilities and still choose to trust is precisely how our personal response to God can be established. The ambiguity between trust and doubt is not something that contradicts faith, rather, it is the very condition that makes faith possible. When you're asked to trust, you can either give that trust or withhold it. It's nonsensical to say that you'll trust only if you're given demonstrative certainty, because there would be no space for trust if certainty were guaranteed. When certainty is finally given, what remains is simply the result of whether you chose to trust or not before certainty arrived. The saying, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed," has little to do with the initial assent to Christian belief. It wasn't addressed to a philosopher wrestling with whether God exists. Instead, it was spoken to someone who already believed in God, who had long-standing acquaintance with a particular person, Christ, and had seen evidence of extraordinary things that person could do. Yet, when asked to believe in one more extraordinary thing, despite predictions from that same person and testimony from all of his closest friends, this man refused. The rebuke was not aimed at skepticism in the philosophical sense, but at a failure of personal trust in someone he already knew well. In short, faith requires room for trust, and that trust exists only when certainty is absent. The ambiguity, the possibility of error. The doubt is what allows for the kind of relationship God seeks with humanity, one based on trust, not mere intellectual assent. The statement, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed," speaks not to skepticism, but to the psychological quality of being overly suspicious. It essentially says, you should have trusted me better. There are moments in human relationships where we can all appreciate and even bless those who trust us without waiting for concrete proof. Our relationship with someone who only trusted us after a court cleared us of charges cannot be the same as our relationship with someone who trusted us all the way through. Trust builds a deeper, more meaningful bond, and that's true in our human relationships just as much as in our relationship with God. Our opponents are fully within their rights to question and challenge the grounds of our initial belief in Christianity. But after we have made that leap of faith, they shouldn't accuse us of insanity for not adjusting our belief with every new piece of contrary evidence that comes along. They might not understand what nourishes and sustains our confidence. They might not see how our faith revives, how it rises from its ashes after every doubt. They may not comprehend how the object of our faith, this God we believe we are starting to know on a personal level, compels us to conclude that if our faith were a delusion, it would be unlike any other delusion. It would mean that the universe had produced no real thing of comparable value, and that all the attempts to explain away the delusion somehow seem trivial compared to what is being explained. This is a kind of knowledge that can't be easily communicated. But what can be communicated is the shift that takes place when someone moves from the logic of abstract, speculative thought to the logic of personal relationships. What might have once been just variations in opinion now become variations in conduct or response by one person to another. Intellectual inquiry turns into engagement, a lived-out relationship with God, who becomes more knowable over time. Let me share an example from my own life. A few years ago, I woke up one morning planning to have my hair cut before a trip to London. But the first letter I opened informed me that I no longer needed to go to London, so I decided to postpone the haircut as well. Then, this strange, persistent thought started nagging at me, almost like a voice, saying, "Get it cut all the same, go and get it cut eventually." I couldn't resist it any longer, so I went. Now, my barber at the time was a fellow Christian who had many troubles, and my brother and I had sometimes been able to help him. The moment I walked into the shop, he said, "Oh, I was praying you might come today. As it turned out, if I had delayed my visit by a day or two, I wouldn't have been able to help him when he needed it most." This experience still amazes me, though of course I can't rigorously prove any causal connection between his prayers and my visit. It could have been telepathy, or it could have been pure coincidence. Another example, I once stood by the bedside of a woman whose thigh bone had been eaten away by cancer, and the disease had spread to other bones as well. She was in such a bad state that it took 3 people just to move her in bed. The doctors predicted she only had a few months to live. The nurses, who often know better, thought she had just a few weeks. A man prayed over her, laying his hands on her, and a year later she was walking uphill through woodland. The doctor who examined her latest x-rays said, "These bones are as solid as rock." It's miraculous, but again, there's no way to rigorously prove that her recovery was due to the prayer. Medicine, as any honest doctor will admit, is not an exact science. We don't have to invoke the supernatural to explain why the doctor's predictions were wrong. So this raises an important question. What kind of evidence would prove the efficacy of prayer? Even when what we pray for happens, we are still left with the option to interpret it in natural terms. Perhaps it was an accident, or perhaps it was a coincidence. This ambiguity is always present, and it keeps the relationship between belief and evidence from being purely mechanical. What these experiences suggest is that faith is not something that can always be logically weighed and measured like a hypothesis in science. Faith, especially in the Christian sense, is about trust in a relationship. It's about maintaining that trust even when the evidence isn't clear or is seemingly contrary. Just as we would expect someone who knows us well to trust us even when circumstances cast doubt, Christians believe that we should trust God in a similar way, believing that even when things seem unclear, God's larger purpose is still good, even if we can't fully grasp it in the moment. The question of how we can ever know if something wouldn't have happened anyway, even if it seems miraculous, is a valid one. Even if a miraculous event did occur, it wouldn't necessarily follow that it happened because of our prayers. The answer, I believe, is that we can never achieve a compulsive empirical proof for the efficacy of prayer, in the same way we can in the sciences. In science, some things are proved by the unbroken uniformity of our experiences. Take the law of gravitation, for example. It's established because in our experience, all bodies without exception follow it. But even if every prayer were granted, that wouldn't prove what Christians mean by the efficacy of prayer. Why? Because prayer is fundamentally a request, not a form of compulsion. A request can be granted or denied. If an infinitely wise being listens to the requests of finite, often foolish creatures, it's only logical that sometimes he will grant those requests, and sometimes he will not. If prayer worked with invariable success, it wouldn't prove Christian prayer would instead suggest something more like magic, a power humans could wield to control or compel the natural world. There are passages in the New Testament that seem at first glance to promise that all prayers will be granted, but we know from the heart of the Christian story that this can't be the case. In Gethsemane, the holiest of all petitioners, Jesus, prayed 3 times that a certain cup, his suffering and crucifixion, might pass from him. It didn't. If even Christ's request wasn't granted in this case, the idea that prayer is some sort of infallible mechanism can be dismissed. Some have suggested conducting experiments on prayer to determine its efficacy, much like an experiment in science. For instance, one proposed experiment involves having a group of people pray fervently for patients in Hospital A, while no one prays for patients in Hospital B, and then comparing the outcomes. But this idea is problematic for several reasons. First, a Christian would be forbidden from taking part in such an experiment because we're not supposed to test God. We're told not to try experiments on God, to put it bluntly. But even if we set aside the religious prohibition, the experiment itself isn't feasible. I've seen this idea suggested that we should pray for all the patients in one hospital, but not for any in another, and then tally the results. However, true prayer cannot operate under these conditions. Prayer isn't just a set of words or a ritual, it's an act of genuine thought and intent. As King Claudius says in Hamlet, words without thoughts never to heaven go. If you're merely saying prayers for the sake of an experiment, you're not actually praying. You can't pray for the recovery of the sick unless your primary intention is truly their recovery. But in this kind of experiment, your real purpose is not their recovery, it's to find out what happens. There's a conflict between your spoken words, the nominal purpose, and your underlying intent, the real purpose. In that sense, whatever your lips and body might be doing, you're not genuinely praying. Therefore, the experiment demands an impossibility. Empirical proof or disproof of prayer's efficacy is unobtainable. But this conclusion becomes less troubling when we remember that prayer is essentially a request. We make requests of our fellow humans as well as of God, and the same doubt about causality often arises in these cases. For example, we ask someone to sing a song, request a raise from our boss, ask a friend to feed our cat while we're on vacation, or ask a person to marry us. Sometimes we get what we ask for, sometimes we don't. But even when we do, it's rarely possible to prove with scientific certainty that our request was the cause. Your neighbor, for instance, may be a kind person who would have fed your cat even if you hadn't asked. Your employer might grant your raise because they know you could get a better offer from another firm, and may have intended to give you that raise regardless. As for the person who agrees to marry you, are you sure they hadn't already made up their mind? Your proposal might have been the result of their decision, not the cause. So in many cases, the same uncertainty about causality in prayer applies to human interactions. Whatever we receive in life, it's always possible that we were going to receive it anyway, regardless of our requests. In conclusion, the uncertainty surrounding the efficacy of prayer is not unique to our communication with God. It also applies to our interactions with other people. Just as we can never be entirely certain that a human granted our request solely because we asked, we cannot empirically prove that God granted a prayer for the same reason. Prayer is more than a transaction, it's an act of trust, relationship, and humility, where outcomes are not guaranteed, but trust in a greater wisdom is sought. But, as I mentioned, this certainty can only be partial. Our friend, boss, or spouse may tell us they acted because we asked, and we might know them well enough to believe that, first, they truly mean what they say, and second, they understand their own motives enough to be correct. Still, this type of assurance doesn't come from scientific methods. We don't conduct control experiments refusing the raise or breaking off the engagement to see if the result is the same when we ask again under different circumstances. Our assurance in these cases is very different from scientific knowledge. It arises from our personal relationship with others, not from knowing things about them, but from knowing them. In the same way, If we reach a point where we feel assured that God hears and sometimes answers our prayers, and that these answers aren't merely coincidences, this confidence doesn't come from tallying up successes and failures or calculating whether the successes outnumber chance occurrences. It comes from knowing God personally. Just as those who know a person best can tell whether their actions were influenced by a request, those who know God best may also sense whether, for example, He directed me to the barber's shop because the barber prayed. The whole question, does prayer work, is flawed from the start. It frames prayer as if it were some kind of magic or a mechanical process, something that works automatically if you push the right buttons. But prayer is either a complete illusion, or it is a personal interaction between finite, developing beings like ourselves and the ultimate, concrete reality that is God. Petitionary prayer, asking for things, is only a small part of prayer. Confession and repentance form its threshold. Adoration is its sanctuary, and the presence, vision, and enjoyment of God are its true bread and wine. In prayer, God reveals Himself to us. That He answers prayers is a consequence of this revelation, but not necessarily the most important one. Petitionary prayer, asking for things, is still allowed and even commanded in Scripture. Give us this day our daily bread. But this does raise a theoretical question. And can we really believe that God, in response to human requests, modifies His actions? After all, infinite wisdom doesn't need to be told what is best, and infinite goodness doesn't need to be persuaded to do it. But neither does God need any of the actions that are carried out by finite beings, whether human, animal, or inanimate. He could, if He wanted, sustain our bodies without food, give us food without the work of farmers, bakers, and butchers, or grant us knowledge without the help of teachers or books. He could convert the unbelievers without missionaries. Yet, He chooses to involve soils, weather, animals, and the muscles, minds, and wills of men in accomplishing His will. In the same way, He has instituted prayer not because He needs it, but to give His creatures the dignity of being part of the causal process. This dignity is not limited to prayer. It extends to all of our actions. Every time we act, He allows our actions to play a role in the unfolding of events. It's not stranger or less strange that our prayers should affect the course of events than that any of our other actions do. Our prayers haven't changed God's overall purpose, but that purpose is realized in different ways depending on the actions and prayers of His creatures. It seems that God does nothing directly that He could delegate to His creatures. He commands us to do slowly and imperfectly what He could do perfectly and instantly. He allows us to neglect His commands or to fail in carrying them out. Perhaps we don't fully appreciate the challenge of allowing finite free wills to coexist with omnipotence. It seems to involve a constant divine abdication of sorts, a giving up of control so that we, His creatures, can have a real role in the world. We are not mere recipients or passive spectators. We are either privileged to share in God's creative process or compelled to collaborate in His work. This participation in creation, this wielding of our small but real influence, is part of the ongoing act of creation, a kind of divine partnership. It's as if creation is continuing right before our eyes, and we are invited to participate. This process, in which God works through us, is how He brings something out of nothing. In a sense, it's like God making God out of nothing by sharing His creative work with us. Of course, what I've described is at best just a mental model or symbol, an attempt to grasp at something far beyond our understanding. All our language on these subjects can only be analogical or parabolic. The reality itself is surely beyond the capacity of our human faculties to fully comprehend. But at the very least, we can try to avoid bad analogies and misleading parables when discussing prayer. Prayer is not a machine where we input the right formula and get predictable results, nor is it magic, where we can manipulate outcomes by sheer will or incantation. It is also not simply advice offered to God, as if He needed direction from us. Our acts of prayer, like all our actions, are part of the continuous action of God Himself, within which all finite causes, including our own, operate. It would be even worse to think of those who receive what they pray for, as if they were some sort of court favorites with influence at the throne of God. The unanswered prayer of Christ in Gethsemane should be enough to dispel that notion. Even Jesus, in His deepest distress, did not get the outcome he requested. There's also that famous French story about the fire in the theater. Panic was spreading, and the audience was about to become a mob. Suddenly, a large, bearded man leaped onto the stage, raised his hand nobly, and commanded everyone to remain calm. Such was his authority and presence that everyone obeyed him. As a result, they were all burned to death, while the man quietly exited through the wings, took a cab, and went home to bed. The demand for trust made by a true friend is exactly the same as the demand made by a con artist. The refusal to trust a trickster is sensible, but withholding trust from a true friend can be deeply damaging to the relationship. Being forewarned and prepared for apparently contradictory appearances is rational if your belief is true. But if your belief is a delusion, this same readiness would be the very means by which the delusion becomes unshakable and incurable. And yet, to be aware of these possibilities and still choose to trust is precisely how our personal response to God can be established. The ambiguity between trust and doubt is not something that contradicts faith, rather, it is the very condition that makes faith possible. When you're asked to trust, you can either give that trust or withhold it. It's nonsensical to say that you'll trust only if you're given demonstrative certainty, because there would be no space for trust if certainty were guaranteed. When certainty is finally given, what remains is simply the result of whether you chose to trust or not before certainty arrived. The saying, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed," has little to do with the initial assent to Christian belief. It wasn't addressed to a philosopher wrestling with whether God exists. Instead, it was spoken to someone who already believed in God, who had long-standing acquaintance with a particular person, Christ, and had seen evidence of extraordinary things that person could do. Yet, when asked to believe in one more extraordinary thing, despite predictions from that same person and testimony from all of his closest friends, this man refused. The rebuke was not aimed at skepticism in the philosophical sense, but at a failure of personal trust in someone he already knew well. In short, faith requires room for trust, and that trust exists only when certainty is absent. The ambiguity, the possibility of error. The doubt is what allows for the kind of relationship God seeks with humanity, one based on trust, not mere intellectual assent. The statement, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed," speaks not to skepticism but to the psychological quality of being overly suspicious. It essentially says, you should have trusted me better. There are moments in human relationships where we can all appreciate and even bless those who trust us without waiting for concrete proof. Our relationship with someone who only trusted us after a court cleared us of charges cannot be the same as our relationship with someone who trusted us all the way through. Trust builds a deeper, more meaningful bond, and that's true in our human relationships just as much as in our relationship with God. Our opponents are fully within their rights to question and challenge the grounds of our initial belief in Christianity. But after we have made that leap of faith, they shouldn't accuse us of insanity for not adjusting our belief with every new piece of contrary evidence that comes along. They might not understand what nourishes and sustains our confidence. They might not see how our faith revives, how it rises from its ashes after every doubt. They may not comprehend how the object of our faith, this God we believe we are starting to know on a personal level, compels us to conclude that if our faith were a delusion, it would be unlike any other delusion. It would mean that the universe had produced no real thing of comparable value, and that all the attempts to explain away the delusion somehow seem trivial compared to what is being explained. This is a kind of knowledge that can't be easily communicated. But what can be communicated is the shift that takes place when someone moves from the logic of abstract, speculative thought to the logic of personal relationships. What might have once been just variations in opinion now become variations in conduct or response by one person to another. Intellectual inquiry turns into engagement, a lived-out relationship with God, who becomes more knowable over time. Let me share an example from my own life. A few years ago, I woke up one morning planning to have my hair cut before a trip to London. But the first letter I opened informed me that I no longer needed to go to London, so I decided to postpone the haircut as well. Then, this strange, persistent thought started nagging at me, almost like a voice, saying, "Get it cut, all the same, go and get it cut eventually." I couldn't resist it any longer, so I went. Now, my barber at the time was a fellow Christian who had many troubles, and my brother and I had sometimes been able to help him. The moment I walked into the shop, he said, "Oh, I was praying you might come today. As it turned out, if I had delayed my visit by a day or two, I wouldn't have been able to help him when he needed it most." This experience still amazes me, though of course I can't rigorously prove any causal connection between his prayers and my visit. It could have been telepathy, or it could have been pure coincidence. Another example, I once stood by the bedside of a woman whose thigh bone had been eaten away by cancer, and the disease had spread to other bones as well. She was in such a bad state that it took 3 people just to move her in bed. The doctors predicted she only had a few months to live. The nurses, who often know better, thought she had just a few weeks. A man prayed over her, laying his hands on her, and a year later she was walking uphill through woodland. The doctor who examined her latest x-rays said, "These bones are as solid as rock." It's miraculous, but again, there's no way to rigorously prove that her recovery was due to the prayer. Medicine, as any honest doctor will admit, is not an exact science. We don't have to invoke the supernatural to explain why the doctor's predictions were wrong. So this raises an important question. What kind of evidence would prove the efficacy of prayer? Even when what we pray for happens, we are still left with the option to interpret it in natural terms. Perhaps it was an accident, or perhaps it was a coincidence. This ambiguity is always present, and it keeps the relationship between belief and evidence from being purely mechanical. What these experiences suggest is that faith is not something that can always be logically weighed and measured like a hypothesis in science. Faith, especially in the Christian sense, is about trust in a relationship. It's about maintaining that trust even when the evidence isn't clear or is seemingly contrary. Just as we would expect someone who knows us well to trust us even when circumstances cast doubt, Christians believe that we should trust God in a similar way, believing that even when things seem unclear, God's larger purpose is still good, even if we can't fully grasp it in the moment. The question of how we can ever know if something wouldn't have happened anyway, even if it seems miraculous, is a valid one. Even if a miraculous event did occur, it wouldn't necessarily follow that it happened because of our prayers. The answer, I believe, is that we can never achieve a compulsive empirical proof for the efficacy of prayer, in the same way we can in the sciences. In science, some things are proved by the unbroken uniformity of our experiences. Take the law of gravitation, for example. It's established because in our experience, all bodies without exception follow it. But even if every prayer were granted, that wouldn't prove what Christians mean by the efficacy of prayer. Why? Because prayer is fundamentally a request, not a form of compulsion. A request can be granted or denied. If an infinitely wise being listens to the requests of finite, often foolish creatures, it's only logical that sometimes he will grant those requests, and sometimes he will not. If prayer worked with invariable success, it wouldn't prove Christian prayer would instead suggest something more like magic, a power humans could wield to control or compel the natural world. There are passages in the New Testament that seem at first glance to promise that all prayers will be granted, but we know from the heart of the Christian story that this can't be the case. In Gethsemane, the holiest of all petitioners, Jesus, prayed 3 times that a certain cup, his suffering and crucifixion, might pass from him. It didn't. If even Christ's request wasn't granted in this case, the idea that prayer is some sort of infallible mechanism can be dismissed. Some have suggested conducting experiments on prayer to determine its efficacy, much like an experiment in science. For instance, one proposed experiment involves having a group of people pray fervently for patients in Hospital A, while no one prays for patients in Hospital B, and then comparing the outcomes. But this idea is problematic for several reasons. First, a Christian would be forbidden from taking part in such an experiment because we're not supposed to test God. We're told not to try experiments on God, to put it bluntly. But even if we set aside the religious prohibition, the experiment itself isn't feasible. I've seen this idea suggested that we should pray for all the patients in one hospital, but not for any in another, and then tally the results. However, true prayer cannot operate under these conditions. Prayer isn't just a set of words or a ritual, it's an act of genuine thought and intent. As King Claudius says in Hamlet, words without thoughts never to heaven go. If you're merely saying prayers for the sake of an experiment, you're not actually praying. You can't pray for the recovery of the sick unless your primary intention is truly their recovery. But in this kind of experiment, your real purpose is not their recovery, it's to find out what happens. There's a conflict between your spoken words, the nominal purpose, and your underlying intent, the real purpose. In that sense, whatever your lips and body might be doing, you're not genuinely praying. Therefore, the experiment demands an impossibility. Empirical proof or disproof of prayer's efficacy is unobtainable. But this conclusion becomes less troubling when we remember that prayer is essentially a request. We make requests of our fellow humans as well as of God, and the same doubt about causality often arises in these cases. For example, we ask someone to sing a song, request a raise from our boss, ask a friend to feed our cat while we're on vacation, or ask a person to marry us. Sometimes we get what we ask for, sometimes we don't. But even when we do, it's rarely possible to prove with scientific certainty that our request was the cause. Your neighbor, for instance, may be a kind person who would have fed your cat even if you hadn't asked. Your employer might grant your raise because they know you could get a better offer from another firm, and may have intended to give you that raise regardless. As for the person who agrees to marry you, are you sure they hadn't already made up their mind? Your proposal might have been the result of their decision, not the cause. So in many cases, the same uncertainty about causality in prayer applies to human interactions. Whatever we receive in life, it's always possible that we were going to receive it anyway, regardless of our requests. In conclusion, the uncertainty surrounding the efficacy of prayer is not unique to our communication with God. It also applies to our interactions with other people. Just as we can never be entirely certain that a human granted our request solely because we asked, we cannot empirically prove that God granted a prayer for the same reason. Prayer is more than a transaction, it's an act of trust, relationship, and humility, where outcomes are not guaranteed, but trust in a greater wisdom is sought. But, as I mentioned, this certainty can only be partial. Our friend, boss, or spouse may tell us they acted because we asked, and we might know them well enough to believe that, first, they truly mean what they say, and second, they understand their own motives enough to be correct. Still, this type of assurance doesn't come from scientific methods. We don't conduct control experiments refusing the raise or breaking off the engagement to see if the result is the same when we ask again under different circumstances. Our assurance in these cases is very different from scientific knowledge. It arises from our personal relationship with others, not from knowing things about them, but from knowing them. In the same way, if we reach a point where we feel assured that God hears and sometimes answers our prayers, and that these answers aren't merely coincidences, this confidence doesn't come from tallying up successes and failures or calculating whether the successes outnumber chance occurrences. It comes from knowing God personally. Just as those who know a person best can tell whether their actions were influenced by a request, those who know God best may also sense whether, for example, He directed me to the barber's shop because the barber prayed. The whole question, does prayer work, is flawed from the start. It frames prayer as if it were some kind of magic or a mechanical process, something that works automatically if you push the right buttons. But prayer is either a complete illusion, or it is a personal interaction between finite, developing beings like ourselves and the ultimate, concrete reality that is God. Petitionary prayer, asking for things, is only a small part of prayer. Confession and repentance form its threshold. Adoration is its sanctuary, and the presence, vision, and enjoyment of God are its true bread and wine. In prayer, God reveals Himself to us. That He answers prayers is a consequence of this revelation, but not necessarily the most important one. Petitionary prayer, asking for things, is still allowed and even commanded in Scripture. Give us this day our daily bread. But this does raise a theoretical question. And can we really believe that God, in response to human requests, modifies His actions? After all, infinite wisdom doesn't need to be told what is best, and infinite goodness doesn't need to be persuaded to do it. But neither does God need any of the actions that are carried out by finite beings, whether human, animal, or inanimate. He could, if he wanted, sustain our bodies without food, give us food without the work of farmers, bakers, and butchers, or grant us knowledge without the help of teachers or books. He could convert the unbelievers without missionaries. Yet, he chooses to involve soils, weather, animals, and the muscles, minds, and wills of men in accomplishing his will. In the same way, he has instituted prayer not because he needs it, but to give his creatures the dignity of being part of the causal process. This dignity is not limited to prayer. It extends to all of our actions. Every time we act, he allows our actions to play a role in the unfolding of events. It's not stranger or less strange that our prayers should affect the course of events than that any of our other actions do. Our prayers haven't changed God's overall purpose, but that purpose is realized in different ways depending on the actions and prayers of his creatures. It seems that God does nothing directly that he could delegate to his creatures. He commands us to do slowly and imperfectly what he could do perfectly and instantly. He allows us to neglect his commands or to fail in carrying them out. Perhaps we don't fully appreciate the challenge of allowing finite free wills to coexist with omnipotence. It seems to involve a constant divine abdication of sorts, a giving up of control so that we, his creatures, can have a real role in the world. We are not mere recipients or passive spectators. We are either privileged to share in God's creative process or compelled to collaborate in his work. This participation in creation, this wielding of our small but real influence, is part of the ongoing act of creation, a kind of divine partnership. It's as if creation is continuing right before our eyes, and we are invited to participate. This process, in which God works through us, is how he brings something out of nothing. In a sense, it's like God making God out of nothing by sharing his creative work with us. Of course, what I've described is at best just a mental model or symbol, an attempt to grasp at something far beyond our understanding. All our language on these subjects can only be analogical or parabolic. The reality itself is surely beyond the capacity of our human faculties to fully comprehend. But at the very least, we can try to avoid bad analogies and misleading parables when discussing prayer. Prayer is not a machine where we input the right formula and get predictable results, nor is it magic, where we can manipulate outcomes by sheer will or incantation. It is also not simply advice offered to God, as if he needed direction from us. Our acts of prayer, like all our actions, are part of the continuous action of God himself, within which all finite causes, including our own, operate. It would be even worse to think of those who receive what they pray for, as if they were some sort of court favorites with influence at the throne of God. The unanswered prayer of Christ in Gethsemane should be enough to dispel that notion. Even Jesus, in his deepest distress, did not get the outcome he requested. I cannot omit a hard truth I once heard from a seasoned Christian. I have seen many striking answers to prayer, some even miraculous in my estimation, but they usually happen early on, around the time of conversion or soon after. As the Christian life progresses, answers to prayer become rarer, and the refusals not only become more frequent but also more unmistakable, even emphatic. Does this mean God forsakes those who serve him best? Consider that the one who served him best of all, Jesus Christ, cried out in his final moments, my God, why have you forsaken me?" when God became man. The man who was closest to him was the least comforted in his greatest hour of need. There is a profound mystery here, one that even if I had the power to explore, I might lack the courage to fully understand. Meanwhile, ordinary people like us should not rush to flattering conclusions when our prayers are granted against all odds. If we were stronger, we might receive less tender treatment. If we were braver, we might be sent with far less help to defend far more desperate positions in the great battle of life. I have encountered two different arguments against my faith, both presented in the name of science. When I was younger, people would claim that the universe was not just indifferent to life but actively hostile toward it. Life on Earth, they argued, had emerged by 1,000,000 to 1 chance, as if there had been a breakdown in the defenses the universe generally maintained against it. Life was, therefore, a terrestrial abnormality, and we were alone in a vast, lifeless desert, which supposedly made the idea of a creator who cared about living creatures seem absurd. Then came Professor Fred Hoyle, the Cambridge cosmologist, and within weeks, it seemed like everyone was saying the opposite, that the universe was likely teeming with habitable planets and life forms. This new discovery was now said to show the absurdity of Christianity, with its parochial idea that human beings could be important to God, when the universe might be filled with other creatures. This shift in arguments should serve as a warning for us. If we ever discover life on another planet, or even just theorize its existence, the first reaction will likely be the same. Some will claim it has profound theological consequences, seizing upon it as a new weapon against Christianity. Others, unfortunately, will jump to use it as an overly enthusiastic defense of the faith. But, as history shows, once the initial excitement dies down and the discovery is thoroughly examined by real theologians, scientists, and philosophers, both believers and unbelievers tend to find themselves more or less where they started. The same pattern played out with Copernican astronomy, Darwinism, biblical criticism, and modern psychology. At first, these discoveries and theories were seen as major challenges to Christian doctrine, but once the dust settled, Christianity endured, as it always has, even when new ideas initially seemed threatening. If life on other planets is ever discovered, I expect much the same reaction. The real theological question that will be posed concerns the doctrine of the incarnation, the belief that for us men and for our salvation, God came down from heaven and was made man. Why? Critics will ask, would God come for us? Why not for other life forms elsewhere in the universe if they exist? If we were to find that we are not the only intelligent life in the universe, it could raise questions about the scope of God's redemptive work. Does it apply only to humans? Does it extend to other beings? But these questions, like so many others throughout history, would likely lead to deeper theological reflection rather than any genuine crisis for the faith. The incarnation, like so many aspects of Christian doctrine, is a mystery that transcends the specifics of our understanding of the cosmos. If other intelligent beings exist, we may come to understand God's relationship with them in ways we cannot yet imagine. Ultimately, the discovery of life elsewhere in the universe would not make the incarnation any less true for us, just as the Copernican revolution didn't diminish the truth of Christianity, even though it changed how we understood our place in the universe. Every new discovery invites us to reconsider and deepen our understanding, but it does not erase the core truths of faith. The question of whether humanity has been uniquely favored by God, given the potential existence of countless other intelligent beings across the universe, is indeed a formidable one. However, it's a question that will only become urgent if and when we have answers to several other fundamental questions. 1. Are there animals anywhere other than on Earth? We simply do not know. We don't know if life exists elsewhere in the universe, and it's unclear whether we will ever know. Until we do, speculating about humanity's place among a potential multitude of intelligent beings remains a largely hypothetical exercise. 2. If there are extraterrestrial animals, do any of them possess rational souls? By rational souls, I mean not just the ability to abstract and calculate, but the capacity to understand values, the ability to perceive good as something beyond mere survival or self-interest, something more than just good for me or good for my species. You could also ask, are they spiritual animals, meaning creatures capable of understanding deeper truths beyond natural instincts? If extraterrestrial life forms exist but lack this spiritual or rational capacity, then it wouldn't be strange that humanity is treated differently. There's no point in offering salvation or divine gifts to beings that, by their nature, are incapable of desiring or receiving them. Just as we teach our sons to reap but not our dogs, since dogs are more interested in bones, spiritual gifts wouldn't be offered to creatures that are solely interested in natural ends. Even if we met extraterrestrial life, determining whether they are rational or spiritual beings might not be easy. It's possible that we could encounter incredibly intelligent creatures capable of communication, who are still merely animals in the theological sense, creatures only capable of pursuing natural ends. We sometimes encounter humans who appear almost machine-like in their materialism and lack of spiritual depth. As Christians, we believe that even in such humans a soul exists, albeit perhaps deeply atrophied. But in another world, we might encounter beings that truly are what these machine-minded humans seem to be. Conversely, there could be creatures whose spiritual capacities are so humble that we might mistake them for mere animals. God, I hope, would shield such gentle beings from our influence. 3. If other species exist, have any of them experienced a fall like humanity's? Non-Christians often overlook this aspect. They assume that the incarnation, God becoming man, implies some special merit or excellence in humanity. But the opposite is true. The incarnation is a response to humanity's depravity, not its merit. No creature deserving redemption would need to be redeemed. Christ came to heal those who were sick, not those who were well. His death was necessary precisely because humanity was not worth dying for. He died to make us worth it. Critics of Christianity, when they raise these questions about extraterrestrial life, often expect us to swim through a sea of unfounded hypotheses. We are now asked to consider the hypothetical fall of hypothetical rational creatures whose pure existence is still unproven. And if some or all of these hypothetical beings have fallen, we are asked whether they have been denied redemption by the incarnation and passion of Christ. But this is not a new idea. It has long been speculated that the eternal Son of God may have been incarnate in other worlds to save other races. As the poet Alice Meynell wrote in her poem Christ in the Universe, "In the eternity, doubtless we shall compare together, hear a million alien gospels. In what guise he trod the Pleiades, the Lyra, the Bear, I wouldn't go so far as to say doubtless myself. But it's possible. Perhaps humanity is the only race that fell. Perhaps we are the one lost sheep for whom the shepherd came to seek. Or perhaps." 4. Could redemption take another form in other worlds? This brings us to the biggest assumption yet. Even if we knew the answers to the first 3 questions, that there are rational creatures, that some of them have fallen, and that they have been denied redemption through an incarnation, can we be certain that incarnation and passion are the only modes of redemption? Is it possible that there could be other ways for God to redeem fallen creatures? Here we venture into the truly unknown. We are asking for knowledge about something beyond our understanding. It's easy for us to assume that, because the incarnation was necessary for our redemption, it must be the universal method for all rational beings. But God's ways may be far more varied and creative than we can comprehend. For all we know, God's redemptive actions in other worlds for other beings might take forms we cannot imagine. Just as God's relationship with humanity includes complexities like grace, free will, and the Trinity concepts beyond our full comprehension, it's entirely possible that his relationship with other creatures, if they exist, involves methods of redemption or grace that are equally beyond our understanding. Conclusion. In the end, these questions remain speculative. We don't know if there are other rational beings in the universe, much less whether they have experienced a fall or require redemption. And if they do, we cannot be sure that God would deal with them in the same way he has dealt with us. To claim that the incarnation is uniquely human without considering other possibilities is premature, because we are dealing with questions far beyond our current knowledge. Ultimately, what we do know is this: God chose to become incarnate as a human for our salvation. Whether he has chosen or would choose to become incarnate for other beings in the universe remains a mystery. Our faith teaches us that God's love and purpose are not bound by our limited understanding. So, rather than seeing the potential discovery of other life forms as a threat to Christian doctrine, it could lead us to a deeper appreciation of the richness and mystery of God's creation and his ways. If other intelligent beings exist, their relationship with God may unfold in ways that neither threaten nor diminish the significance of the incarnation for humanity. You're right to suggest that unless God were to reveal it, the full truth about the cosmic scope of redemption is beyond our knowledge. It's possible that if we were permitted to see more deeply into God's nature and the nature of sin, we might realize that the rescue of a fallen race could only happen thus, and not otherwise through the birth at Bethlehem, the cross at Calvary, and the empty tomb. There might be an insurmountable necessity for this particular mode of redemption, rooted in the very nature of God and sin. But we don't know, or at least I don't. It's important to remember that spiritual, as well as physical, conditions could vary widely in different worlds, should they exist. There could be different types and degrees of fallenness, and God's boundless charity might have developed different remedies for each situation, tailored to the specific spiritual state of those creatures. Just as a skilled physician uses different treatments for different illnesses or even for different patients with the same illness, God's methods of redemption may vary in ways we wouldn't recognize, even if we were told about them. It might even be possible that the redemption of other species, should they need it, could work through our own redemption. St. Paul hints at something like this in Romans 8:19-23, where he writes about all creation longing to be set free from bondage and waiting for the revelation of the children of God. On one level, Paul was probably referring only to the life on earth, animal, and perhaps plant life being renewed at the glorification of humanity in Christ. But it's not impossible to imagine that Paul's words could have a wider cosmic significance, suggesting that redemption begins with us but extends outward through us. If this were the case, it would indeed give humanity a pivotal role in the universe. However, such a role wouldn't imply any superiority on our part or favoritism from God when a general chooses where to begin his attack. He doesn't pick the prettiest or most fertile land, he chooses the spot that is strategically necessary. Similarly, Christ wasn't born in a stable because it was the most convenient or distinguished place for a birth, but because it was part of God's strategy to redeem the world. Only if we had some crucial function in the cosmic order could contact between us and other races be anything but a disaster. If we were unfallen, it would be a different matter entirely. We could imagine a glorious scenario where we exchange thoughts with beings whose sensory and intellectual backgrounds are wholly different from ours. We could be humbled by their superior intellect, which for that very reason could lovingly descend to communicate with us. Or we could meet childlike, innocent creatures who might not be as strong or clever as we are, but with whom we could share a deep affection, born from the richness of difference. It's a beautiful dream, full of the potential for mutual enrichment and love between radically different species. But we mustn't forget that it's only a dream. The reality is that we are fallen, and we know all too well what our race does to strangers. Humans have destroyed, enslaved, and exploited nearly every species they've encountered. Civilized man has murdered, cheated, and corrupted, while even savage man has ruined the land, turning it into dust bowls and slag heaps. There are, of course, individuals who act differently, but they are not likely to be our ambassadors in space. The first human pioneers to make contact with other worlds would most likely be driven by greed or ambition. Whether it's the reckless adventurer or the ruthless technical expert, these are the types who have historically led exploration. What would happen if they encountered beings weaker than themselves? The histories of the black man and the red man in contact with European colonizers tell that story all too well. And if they were to meet beings stronger than themselves, they would probably be destroyed. It's worth considering how things might play out if humanity encountered an unfallen race. At first, we might try to exploit their innocence, mocking, deceiving, and manipulating them. But I doubt that our half-animal cunning would stand much chance against the godlike wisdom, selfless courage, and perfect unity of an unfallen people. Ultimately, my fear is not about the theological or philosophical implications of meeting another rational species. It's about the practical, moral problems that would arise if we ever meet rational creatures that are not human. I fear that we will commit the same crimes against them that we have already committed against our fellow humans and the world we live in. The theoretical question of whether other beings need redemption, or whether God has already worked to redeem them, is intriguing but distant. What we need to worry about now If and when we encounter other intelligent beings is how we will treat them. Our record, both with the natural world and with other human beings, doesn't inspire much confidence. If we can't learn to treat our own species with dignity and respect, what hope is there that we will do any better with those from beyond Earth? The idea of encountering beings from other worlds, beings who might differ from us in appearance and nature, presents a deep moral and spiritual challenge. Imagine looking up at the starry heavens, once a source of wonder, and feeling nothing but guilt, pity, and shame for the exploitation of these other creatures. After the initial surge of exploitation, as history suggests, we would likely attempt to correct our course. We might send missionaries, but history has shown us the dangers of mingling gun and gospel missionaries, driven by a holy desire to save souls, have not always been able to separate that mission from an arrogant impulse to civilize the so-called natives. This raises a critical question. If missionaries met an unfallen race, would they even recognize it? Could they? Would they? Would they continue pressing upon these innocent creatures a plan of salvation meant for a fallen race like ours? Would they denounce behaviors in those beings that are, in fact, fully justified by their spiritual and biological history, behaviors that God may have blessed? Would they try to teach when they should instead be learning from those creatures? I don't know the answers to these questions, but what I do know is that we must prepare for such possibilities now, by resolving to stand firm against all forms of exploitation and theological imperialism. It won't be easy. We will be accused of betraying our own species. We will be hated, even by some religious people, but we cannot give an inch. We may fail, but we must fight for the right side. Our loyalty is not to humanity as a species, but to God. Our true brothers are those whose in become his sons, even if they look utterly different from us, with shells, tusks, or other features alien to us. What counts is spiritual kinship, not biological resemblance. Thankfully, we are still far from interstellar travel, and I sometimes wonder whether the vast distances between stars are God's own quarantine precautions. Perhaps these enormous gaps prevent the spiritual infection of a fallen species like ours from spreading to other worlds. We are also far from facing the supposed theological dilemma that contact with other rational species would raise. These beings may not even exist. There is not a shred of empirical evidence for their existence, just speculative arguments that begin with phrases like, "It is only threshold to suppose," or "All analogies suggest." These make for good reading, but who in their right mind would risk money, even $5, on such flimsy grounds in everyday life? Even if we did discover these creatures, their mere existence would not present an immediate theological problem. We would still need to know whether they are fallen, whether they have been or will be redeemed, and whether the mode of redemption that applies to us applies to them. And even then, we'd have to ask if no other mode of redemption is possible for them. If this is the most difficult problem a Christian's faith ever faces, I think we're in a pretty good position. These speculative phantoms pose no real threat to our beliefs. St. Augustine once pondered the theological status of satyrs, monopods, and other semi-human creatures in mythology. He decided it was a question that could wait until we knew for sure if such creatures existed. We can take the same approach here. Let's wait until there is some evidence before worrying about the theology of other rational species. But supposing, just for argument's sake, that all these uncomfortable suppositions turned out to be true, what then? I can only say that I am deeply convinced they won't. Over the years, this conviction has become irresistible. Again and again, both Christians and their opponents expect that some new scientific discovery will either validate matters of faith as matters of undeniable knowledge or reduce them to absurdities, but it never happens. What we believe always remains intellectually possible. It never becomes intellectually compulsory. I suspect that when this balance changes, when the evidence for or against faith becomes so overwhelming that doubt is impossible, it will signal the end of the world as we know it. In fact, we've been warned that near the end, evidence against Christianity will become so strong that it could deceive, if possible, even the very elect. After that, there will be fully conclusive evidence on the other side, when all things are revealed and made clear. Until then, faith remains a matter of trust and personal conviction, always possible, but never forced upon us. Until quite modern times, especially before the era of the Romantics, no one seemed to suggest that literature and the arts were an end in themselves. The arts were seen as a part of the ornamental aspects of life, serving purposes like providing innocent diversion, refining manners, inspiring virtue, or glorifying the gods. The great music was written for religious services. The masterpieces of painting were commissioned to fill spaces on a noble patron's dining room wall, or to kindle devotion in a church. And the greatest plays were written either by religious poets honoring Dionysus or by commercial poets entertaining Londoners during half-holidays. It was only in the 19th century, with the rise of Romanticism, that art began to be viewed as something more. We started to attribute a higher dignity to the arts, taking them more seriously as significant in their own right. However, this shift seems to have caused a sort of dislocation in the aesthetic life. On one hand, there are now high-minded works that fewer and fewer people seem to want to read, hear, or see. On the other hand, we have popular works, enjoyed by many but often accompanied by a sense of shame or guilt from both the creators and the audience, shame from not holding them to the same lofty artistic ideals that we've come to associate with serious art. By valuing art too highly in one regard, we may have lost something of its natural, accessible charm. But when a lesser good is elevated to the status of a primary one, we risk losing not only the higher good but also the lesser one itself. The more I examined this, the more I became convinced that it reflects a universal law. For example, a woman who makes her dog the center of her life will, in the end, not only lose her human usefulness and dignity but also the genuine joy of keeping a dog. Similarly, a man who makes alcohol his highest good loses not just his job, but also his ability to enjoy the early, more pleasurable stages of drinking. It's a wonderful, even glorious thing to feel, for a moment, that the entire meaning of the universe is summed up in a single person, like a woman one loves. That feeling is rich and valuable so long as life's other duties and pleasures pull you away from her from time to time. But if you clear your life of all other obligations and arrange it so that nothing distracts you from contemplating her, what happens then? The enchantment fades. This principle is nothing new, but it bears repeating. It can be stated like this: whenever we prefer a lesser good over a greater one, or a partial good over a total one, we ultimately lose the lesser good for which we sacrificed the greater. The world seems to be structured this way. You cannot get second things by putting them first. Second things only come when we prioritize first things.